Alright, picture this. It's the year 850. The air smells like wood smoke in the sea. You're standing on the rocky coast of what we now call Norway. Around you, long wooden houses dot the landscape, goats bleat in the distance, and the distant thud of an axe hitting a log echoes across the hills. Welcome to the Viking Age. The Viking Age stretched from around 793 to 1066 AD, and it was a wild, fascinating time. People often think of Vikings as horn-helmeted warriors charging into battle, and sure, raiding was part of their world. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. Vikings were also farmers, traders, shipbuilders, and storytellers. They lived in harsh environments, relied on the land, and had incredibly rich cultures. Here's what I think: if you wanted to survive in this world, you'd need more than a sword. You'd need skills, community, and a whole lot of resilience. So, who are these people? Well, the term Viking actually referred to an activity, raiding or exploring by sea, not a group of people. Most of the folks living in Scandinavia at the time were simply Norse people. They spoke Old Norse, believed in gods like Odin and Freya, and lived in tight-knit communities. You won't believe this, but despite their reputation, most Vikings weren't warriors at all. They were farmers and craftsmen just trying to make it through long, cold winters. So if you really want to know how to survive in the Viking Age, you've got to understand what everyday life was like. Let's take a walk through a Viking village, shall we? Let's step inside a Viking home, no knocking necessary. Imagine a long wooden structure, sturdy and low to the ground, built to handle fierce Nordic winds and heaps of snow. These were called longhouses, and they weren't just for people. Chickens, goats, and sometimes even cows might share that space with you. Cozy, right? The Viking longhouse was the heart of the family. Built from timber, turf, or even stone, depending on what was available nearby, it could be anywhere from 15 to 75 feet long. A turf roof helped keep in the warmth, while thick walls gave shelter from storms. Inside, things were pretty simple. The central feature? A fire pit running along the middle of the room. It was used for cooking, heating, and light, but it also filled the place with smoke, since chimneys weren't really a thing yet. Instead, smoke drifted out through a hole in the roof. So yeah, everyone probably smelled like smoke, and their eyes watered a lot. Beds lined the walls, with storage space tucked underneath. The beds were short, people usually slept in a half-sitting position, likely because of all that smoke hanging around. There were animal skins, woolen blankets, and sometimes carved headboards. And guess what? There were no individual rooms. Everyone, parents, kids, grandparents, maybe even a servant or two, slept and ate in the same open space. Privacy? That was a luxury they didn't know they were missing. As for furniture, think benches instead of chairs, simple wooden chests instead of wardrobes, and hand-carved tools and utensils. Life was practical. Everything had a use. You might be wondering, what did people actually do inside these houses all day? Well, during the long winters, homes were buzzing with activity. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and cooked stews over the fire. Men might repair tools, make weapons, or carve wooden objects. Kids helped out, played with handmade toys, or listened to the old stories passed down by elders. Speaking of stories, these long evenings were prime time for sagas and myths. With no books or Netflix, oral tradition was everything. It wasn't just entertainment, it was how history and values were passed down. Now, longhouses weren't isolated out in the middle of nowhere. They were part of small farms or settlements. A cluster of homes might form a village, with shared wells, pasture land, and often a temple or communal hall. Everyone knew everyone, and cooperation was key. After all, if your roof caved in or your barn caught fire, you'd need help from your neighbors. So, in a nutshell, the Viking home was more than a building, it was the center of life. It sheltered, warmed, fed, and united the family. Not fancy, not comfortable by modern standards, but it did the job. Now that we've warmed up by the hearth, let's step outside and see what the Viking world looked like beyond those turf walls. Alright, here's where things get tasty, or at least practical. Viking food wasn't about gourmet meals or fancy desserts. It was about survival. But that doesn't mean it wasn't good. In fact, their diet was surprisingly rich and varied, considering the challenges they faced. So, let's talk about where it all started, the land. Vikings were farmers first and foremost. They grew crops like barley, rye, oats, and sometimes wheat, though that was harder to grow in colder regions. Barley was the go-to grain. It was used for baking bread, making porridge, and, importantly, brewing beer. That's right, beer was a staple, even for kids, because it was safer than drinking untreated water. They also grew vegetables like cabbage, leeks, onions, beans, and turnips. These hardy crops could survive in the harsh Scandinavian climate. Fruit was a treat, mostly in the form of apples and berries during the short summer. Livestock played a huge role in the Viking diet. Most households had cows for milk, goats for cheese, chickens for eggs, and pigs or sheep for meat. Meat was eaten regularly, especially pork, which was a favorite. When it came time to slaughter animals, nothing went to waste. Organ meats, fat, and bones all had a purpose. But wait, what about fish? Oh, you better believe it. With all that coastline and rivers, fish was a major food source. Cod, herring, salmon, you name it. They dried or smoked fish to preserve it for the winter. Some settlements even exported dried fish, especially from Norway, where it was practically a business. And hunting? Yep. Vikings hunted wild game like deer, elk, boar, and birds. It wasn't the main source of meat, but it added variety and excitement to the menu. Plus, the pelts were great for clothing. Now here's where it gets clever, preservation. Because of the long winters, Vikings had to think ahead. They salted, smoked, dried, or fermented foods to store them for months. Imagine barrels of pickled vegetables, salted herring, or dried meat lining the walls of a cool storage shed. Cooking was done over an open fire in a cauldron or on a flat stone. Stews were common, just toss in whatever meat, veg, or grain you had and let it bubble. Bread was baked on hot stones or in clay ovens, sometimes flat and dense, sometimes risen with natural yeast. And yes, they had dairy. Cheese, butter, milk, it all came from cows, goats, and sheep. Viking cheese was often soft and fresh, and butter was a prized fat for cooking or eating straight with bread. For sweeteners, honey was the gold standard. It flavored drinks, desserts, and even medicine. Vikings didn't have sugar, so honey was precious. And with honey came mead, fermented honey water that was both drink and celebration. Special occasions called for feasts, and those could get wild. Whole animals were roasted, ale flowed freely, and songs echoed into the night. These events bonded communities and marked everything from births to harvests to funerals. So, what's the takeaway? Viking food was rustic but resourceful. They knew their land, worked it hard, and made the most of every season. No waste, no fuss, just real, hearty eating. Let's be honest, living in Scandinavia back then wasn't exactly a walk in the park. The weather? Brutal. Winters were long, dark, and freezing. Summers? Short, but full of work. So how did people survive? They planned, they worked hard, and they stuck together. During the summer, it was go time. Farming, fishing, building, gathering, it all had to happen while the sun was out and the land was alive. Crops had to be harvested, firewood chopped, tools repaired, and animals fattened up. Every sunny hour counted. Then came winter. Days turned dark, snow piled high, and travel became nearly impossible. You stayed indoors, huddled around the fire, living off whatever you'd stored. It was a time for mending clothes, telling tales, and praying the supplies lasted. Clothing helped too. Wool tunics, cloaks, fur-lined boots, they layered up to stay warm. And believe it or not, they were pretty stylish with their brooches and belts. Community was key. Neighbors helped each other, especially when someone fell ill or ran low on food. You couldn't afford to go it alone. That spirit of cooperation? It's part of what kept Viking societies going. But growing and preparing food wasn't the only part of Viking survival. You had to protect your home, deal with the weather, and work as a unit. Which brings us to a very important question: who did what? How did families divide all the tasks needed to make it through the year? Great question, because understanding that will give us a deeper look into daily life. Let's take a look at the gender roles and division of labor in Viking society next. Here's what I think: one of the most fascinating things about Viking society is how flexible, but also deeply structured, their division of labor was. You won't believe this, but Viking women had more rights and responsibilities than many of their European neighbors at the time. Sure, the society was patriarchal in many ways, but when it came to survival, practicality often trumped tradition. Let's start with the basics. Viking life was hard. And I mean really hard. It wasn't about who stayed home and who went to work. Everyone worked. Every hand counted. So, labor wasn't just divided by gender, it was also divided by age, season, and social status. Now, men typically handled the tasks that took them away from home or required heavy manual labor. That included farming the land, sailing on trade or raiding voyages, blacksmithing, woodworking, and construction. They were the warriors, the merchants, and the political leaders. But, and this is a big but, they weren't doing this alone or in a vacuum. Women were the powerhouses of the home. They managed the household economy, which was no small feat. Think about it. They oversaw food production, clothing manufacture, child rearing, and often even healing. If a Viking woman ran a farm while her husband was off raiding, she had full control over that estate. She could make decisions, defend it, and maintain the workforce. In fact, the Norse word for wife, husfrua, literally means mistress of the house. Sounds powerful, doesn't it? Women controlled the keys to the food storage, the chests of valuables, and sometimes even family heirlooms and religious artifacts. And when it came to textile production, Viking women were incredibly skilled. Spinning, weaving, dyeing, and sewing were constant activities. Clothing had to be warm, practical, and sometimes decorative. These tasks weren't just chores, they were essential for survival in harsh Scandinavian winters. Plus, textiles were also traded, making them part of the wider economy. Now here's a fun twist: Viking women could inherit property, divorce their husbands, and reclaim their dowries. That kind of legal power was pretty rare in Europe at the time. Of course, not every woman had these rights equally. Wealth, social status, and local customs played a role, but still, it's impressive. Let's not forget the children. From an early age, Viking kids were expected to contribute. Girls learned from their mothers how to cook, weave, tend to animals, and manage the home. Boys were trained by their fathers or community elders in farming, hunting, fishing, and combat. They didn't have much of a childhood as we think of it today. Play and learning blended into chores and training. Older adults, too, had roles to play. Elders were respected for their wisdom and often helped care for children or guide household and community decisions. Storytelling was a big deal. Oral history, after all, was how knowledge passed from one generation to the next. You might be wondering, what about social status? Great question. Not all Viking men or women did the same tasks. Wealthier families might have thralls, enslaved people, who handled the dirtiest or most physically demanding labor. Thralls cooked, cleaned, farmed, and could even be traded or inherited. Their presence also shaped how free men and women organized their work. Speaking of thralls, it's a topic that can't be ignored. Thralls were a major part of the labor system, and while their lives were harsh, some could eventually gain freedom and rise in status. Still, their existence tells us a lot about the social hierarchy, which we'll get into in the next section. But back to labor roles for a moment. Did women ever fight? While it wasn't the norm, there's growing evidence that some Viking women might have joined battles, either in myth or in reality. Stories of shield maidens like Lagra pop up in the sagas. And a few burial sites have sparked debate, showing female skeletons buried with weapons and warrior gear. Was this symbolic, ceremonial, or real? The jury's still out, but it does make you wonder. So, to sum it up, Viking society needed every person, man, woman, child, or elder, to pull their weight. Labor was gendered, yes, but not rigid. Survival demanded flexibility, skill, and cooperation. Whether in the field, at the loom, or on a longship, everyone had a role to play. And now that we understand who did what, let's look at who stood where, because the social structure of Viking society was a whole other world in itself. So, you've got your warriors, your farmers, your thralls. How did it all fit together? Let's talk about the social ladder in Viking society. Spoiler alert, it wasn't as rigid as you might think, but it wasn't exactly a free-for-all either. At the very top, we had the Jarls. Think of them as the Viking nobility or aristocrats. These were the powerful landowners, chieftains, and war leaders who held both wealth and influence. A Jarl owned multiple farms, had warriors at his command, and played a big role in local and regional politics. Jarls were often well-connected, sometimes through bloodlines, sometimes through sheer might. They threw lavish feasts, funded ships for raids, and maintained loyalty through gift-giving and protection. Beneath them were the carls, freemen. This was the largest group in Viking society, and their roles were diverse. A carl might be a farmer, a blacksmith, a trader, or a sailor. They owned land, or rented it, paid taxes, could vote in the local assembly, the thing, and had legal rights. Life wasn't always easy, but carls had social mobility. If a carl gained wealth or renown, he might rise in status, or at least improve his family's prospects. Then, at the bottom, we find the thralls. These were enslaved people, and their lives were hard, no sugarcoating it. Thralls might be born into slavery, captured during raids, or forced into servitude through debt. They worked the fields, tended livestock, cooked meals, and did manual labor. They couldn't vote, couldn't marry freely, and didn't have full legal protection. But here's an interesting twist: some thralls could eventually earn or buy their freedom. Once freed, they became freedmen, a kind of middle status between thrall and carl. This three-tier system wasn't just about money, it was about reputation, honor, and connections. Vikings were big on personal reputation. A man's word, bravery, generosity, and loyalty mattered. Honor could be gained or lost quickly, and entire families could rise or fall with one bad decision, or one glorious victory. You might be asking, what about women? Great question again. While the hierarchy mainly referred to men, women's status often followed that of their husbands or fathers. But as we saw earlier, women had their own forms of influence, especially in the home and in managing wealth. Religion also played a role in social dynamics. Priests and priestesses weren't a formal caste, but those who led religious rituals or had spiritual knowledge often held a respected place in the community. Skalds, poets and storytellers were also valued, especially if they served a noble household. And here's the cool part: social mobility existed. A brave warrior could win land and treasure on a raid and come home a hero. A thrall could gain freedom and build a life as a freeman. A carl's daughter might marry into a wealthier family and elevate her household. The Norse world valued strength, courage, and cleverness. But it wasn't all about individual glory. Community mattered. Viking society ran on networks of family, clan, and alliances. These bonds could mean the difference between success and ruin. Now, with all these people living, working, and interacting together, you need a system to keep things running smoothly, right? That's where law and order comes in. So next, let's explore how the Vikings managed disputes, justice, and social rules, without a modern police force. Let's be honest, when we picture the Vikings, we tend to imagine wild warriors charging into battle, axes raised, shouting at the top of their lungs. And yeah, there was definitely a lot of that. But here's the twist, Vikings weren't just fierce, they were also surprisingly organized. You won't believe this, but they had a pretty solid system of law and order. No cops, no prisons, no judges in black robes, yet things didn't just fall apart. How did that work? Well, let's dive in. Viking society was governed by a combination of tradition, honor, and community-based legal systems. At the center of it all was something called the Thing. No, not a scary monster, Thing, or ing, was their word for a public assembly. Think of it as a mix between a town hall meeting and a local court. The Thing brought together free men from a region to settle disputes, create laws, and make important decisions. Each district or region had its own Thing, and some areas even had larger assemblies known as the Althing, which served as a kind of national parliament. Iceland's Althing, established around 930 CE, is actually one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world. Pretty cool, right? Now, here's how it worked. If you had a complaint, say, your neighbor let his sheep trample your barley field, or worse, someone killed your cousin, you brought your case to the Thing. Witnesses were called, oaths were sworn, and community members helped decide what was fair. There were no lawyers, just spoken testimony, personal honor, and a good memory for past cases and customary laws. And speaking of honor, that was the glue that held everything together. Viking law wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoring balance. If you wronged someone, the goal was to make things right, usually through compensation. This was called wergild, or man price. Every person had a set value depending on their social rank. If a free man was killed, his family could demand a specific payment from the killer's family. Refuse to pay? Then the feud continued. Sounds intense, right? But it worked. In fact, avoiding blood feuds was one of the main reasons the Thing existed. People didn't want their communities torn apart by cycles of revenge. So, this system of compensation and mediation helped keep the peace. Of course, not every case ended peacefully. If someone refused to accept the ruling of the Thing or didn't pay the wergild, they could be declared an outlaw. And let me tell you, being outlawed in Viking times was brutal. It meant you had no legal protection. Anyone could harm you, or even kill you, without facing consequences. You were basically erased from society. There were other punishments too. Fines were common, and in some cases, public shaming or temporary exile was used. But imprisonment? Nope. Vikings didn't build jails. They believed it was better to make someone pay up or be removed entirely than to waste resources locking them up. Laws varied from region to region, but they were all based on oral tradition. That meant laws were memorized and recited by designated law speakers or lawsayers. These individuals held incredible responsibility. At the Althing, for example, the law speaker would stand and recite key laws from memory each year to ensure they weren't forgotten. Can you imagine the pressure of getting that right? Religion and custom also played a role in law. Oaths were taken very seriously. Swearing falsely on a sacred object, like Thor's hammer or a family heirloom, could bring shame and misfortune. And remember, Vikings believed in fate, so messing with the truth wasn't just dishonorable, it was dangerous. Now, here's an interesting twist. While men dominated the legal system, women had rights, too. They could bring cases to the Thing, especially in matters of inheritance, property disputes, or abuse. A woman could divorce her husband by calling witnesses and declaring the marriage over. She'd keep her dowry and any belongings she brought into the marriage. That's a level of legal independence that many other cultures didn't offer. The law even extended to trade and raids. Agreements had to be honored, and breaking a deal could damage your reputation for life. That mattered because trust was everything. A good reputation opened doors, socially and economically. A bad one closed them fast. So, Were Vikings brutal? Yes. Were they chaotic? Not really. Their legal system was deeply rooted in honor, community, and tradition. It wasn't perfect, but it helped them survive, thrive, and expand across the known world. And speaking of tradition, next, let's look at how their religious beliefs shaped everyday life. You might be surprised just how connected their gods were to law, justice, and survival. When you think of Viking religion, chances are Norse gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya come to mind, mighty figures wielding hammers and wisdom across epic tales. But here's the thing, Viking religious practices were far more than just mythical stories. Their beliefs shaped how they lived, how they died, and even how they explored the world. So, let's pull back the curtain and step into the spiritual world of the Vikings. First off, the Vikings didn't have a holy book or centralized church like we think of today. Nope, their religion was oral, passed down through sagas, poems, and everyday customs. That meant their spiritual beliefs were woven directly into daily life. The line between the sacred and the ordinary? Super thin. They believed in a pantheon of gods and goddesses who lived in Asgard and interacted regularly with the human world, Midgard. Odin was the All-Father, the god of war, wisdom, and death. Thor, his hammer-wielding son, protected humanity and brought thunder. Then there was Freya, goddess of love and fertility, and Loki, the mischievous trickster who often stirred up chaos. But here's something cool, Vikings didn't just worship the gods out of fear. It was about maintaining balance. You'd make offerings to Thor before a sea journey, or to Freyr, god of fertility, before planting crops. These offerings, called blots, included food, drink, or animals, and they were made at home or at special sacred sites. And yes, sometimes those offerings included sacrifices. Not always human, though. Animal sacrifices were more common. The idea was to honor the gods and ensure their favor. Picture a big feast where everyone eats, drinks, and celebrates the gods, kind of like a spiritual party. These gatherings were also a great way to strengthen community ties. Now, the Vikings didn't go to temples every week. Most worship happened at home or at outdoor altars called horger. But there were a few places of special spiritual importance. The temple at Uppsala in Sweden, for example, was a major religious hub. Descriptions from outsiders, like the Christian chronicler Adam of Bremen, paint a vivid picture of gold statues, sacred groves, and elaborate rituals. Speaking of Christians, yeah, things got complicated. As the Viking Age rolled on, more Norse communities came into contact with Christianity. Missionaries arrived, kings converted, and by the 11th century, most of Scandinavia had officially embraced Christianity. But that didn't mean everyone just abandoned the old gods overnight. For a long time, Norse paganism and Christianity coexisted. People might be baptized in church but still leave offerings to Thor. Some even carved runestones with both crosses and Thor's hammer, hedging their spiritual bets, you might say. Death and the afterlife played a huge role in Viking belief. You've probably heard of Valhalla, Odin's great hall where warriors slain in battle go to feast forever. But that was just one possible destination. Others might end up in Folkvanger, Freya's hall, or Hell, a neutral underworld ruled by the goddess Hel. Your afterlife depended on how you lived, and how you died. Funeral practices reflected this belief. Important people were buried with weapons, tools, even ships. Why? Because they'd need them in the next life. Some were cremated, others buried in mounds. The famous Oseberg ship burial in Norway? That's a real example of just how seriously they took their send-offs. And don't forget the spirits, Landvetter, land spirits, and ancestors played a big role in their belief system. Vikings believed that spirits lived in rocks, trees, and water. Before settling land, they might offer gifts to the spirits there to avoid bad luck. Ancestors were honored too. Some families kept small shrines or stones to remember the dead. Viking magic and Sidr, a form of sorcery, added another layer to their spirituality. Practiced mostly by women called vulvas, Sidr involved rituals, chants, and visions of the future. Vulvas were both respected and feared. They were seen as tapping into powerful, mysterious forces. Now, here's something interesting, the gods weren't perfect. Odin was wise, yes, but also a bit ruthless. Loki could be fun but incredibly destructive. That complexity made them relatable. Vikings didn't expect divine perfection, they saw the gods as reflections of human nature. So what changed? Over time, Christianity became dominant, and many Norse traditions faded. But not all was lost. Today, the old stories live on in sagas, symbols, and even pop culture. And in some places, people are reviving Norse paganism as a modern spiritual path. Viking religion wasn't just about gods, it was about understanding life, death, and the world around them. It gave meaning to their struggles and courage to face the unknown. And speaking of unknowns, what did they do when someone got sick or injured in a world without hospitals? Let's find out in the next section, Viking medicine and healing. Alright, let's talk about something we all rely on, healthcare. Now, imagine being a Viking with a nasty cut, a fever, or even a broken bone. No hospitals. No antibiotics. No sterile bandages. So, how did they survive injuries and illness in a time when even a small infection could turn deadly? Well, first of all, the Vikings weren't as helpless as you might think. They had a surprising range of medical knowledge. Their approach to medicine was a mix of practical remedies, herbal treatments, spiritual beliefs, and a solid dose of common sense. Let's break it down. Healing in the hands of the family and community. Most medical care took place right at home. There were no doctors in the modern sense, but every household had someone who knew the basics, often women. Mothers, wives, and elder women passed down knowledge of herbs, poultices, and techniques through generations. These women were like early nurses and midwives. They treated wounds, managed childbirth, and tried to ease the symptoms of common illnesses. For more serious cases, people would call on specialists known as leeches or folk healers, sort of like the Viking version of a general practitioner. The power of plants' herbal medicine was huge in Viking culture. They had access to a wide variety of local plants, and they knew which ones could help and which could hurt. Willow bark, for example, was used for pain relief. Sound familiar? That's because willow bark contains salicin, which is the natural form of what we now know as aspirin. Other favorites included yarrow to stop bleeding, chamomile for calming nerves, and garlic for fighting infections. Honey, surprisingly, was also used on wounds. Why? It's naturally antibacterial. They might not have known about microbes, but they could see that honey helped wounds heal better. Surgery. Sort of now, surgery was rare and understandably terrifying. But it wasn't unheard of. Archaeologists have found Viking skulls with clear evidence of trepanation, a process where a hole is carved into the skull. And get this, some of the bones show signs of healing, which means the patients actually survived the procedure. They also performed simple bone setting, especially for broken arms or legs. Splints made of wood or bone were tied with cloth. Cleaning wounds with water, vinegar, or even urine, really, was common to prevent infection. Again, no idea why it worked, but it often did. Mysticism and medicine. Of course, healing wasn't just about herbs and tools. The Vikings also believed in magical and spiritual healing. Remember the Volva from earlier? These seeresses sometimes doubled as spiritual healers. They'd use incantations, runes, and charms to drive out illness, which was often seen as caused by evil spirits or the displeasure of the gods. For instance, if someone fell ill after a strange dream, people might think they'd been cursed. A Volva could be called in to perform rituals or chant Galdr, magical songs, to protect or heal the person. Sometimes, these rituals were more about hope and morale than actual results, but belief can be powerful. The importance of diet and cleanliness. Here's something we don't often give them enough credit for: the Vikings paid attention to hygiene. Bathing was a regular habit, usually once a week. In fact, other Europeans joked that Scandinavians were obsessed with cleanliness. This cleanliness helped reduce disease and infection. They also valued good food. A strong diet was considered key to staying healthy, and people often added medicinal herbs to their food for preventive care. Milk, meat, fish, grains, and vegetables made up a fairly balanced diet, especially for those who could afford variety. Seasonal fasting and feasting were also spiritual events, which sometimes doubled as detoxes, so to speak. Toothache troubles and other common woes. Toothaches were awful, no surprise there. With no dentists, people used sharp tools to dig out teeth or relieve pressure. They'd chew herbs or rinse with strong alcoholic drinks to numb the pain. Arthritis, poor eyesight, infections, and injuries from work or battle were common. Sometimes, if things got really bad, they might even try bloodletting to balance the humors. That's a shared idea from medieval medicine, essentially draining some blood to remove illness. Gross? Definitely. Effective? Sometimes, maybe. Mental health and healing the mind. What about mental health? Well, it wasn't a recognized field, but that doesn't mean they ignored it. Anxiety, grief, or madness were often viewed through a spiritual lens. Healing could involve rest, storytelling, song, prayer, or community support. Shamans or wise elders would help guide those struggling with emotional turmoil. People with unique behaviors might be seen as touched by the gods or given special roles, rather than just cast out. It's a surprisingly nuanced view for a time so far removed from modern psychology. Burial clues and skeletal evidence. Want some proof that Viking medicine had its place? Archaeologists have found skeletons with healed bones, suggesting care and rest were provided. Some graves contain medical tools like tweezers, scalpel-like blades, and herbal pouches. These weren't random, they were used for real treatments. There are even accounts of warriors surviving battle wounds that would normally be fatal: deep cuts, crushed bones, serious burns. It wasn't all luck. Their communities rallied around them with whatever knowledge and resources they had. In summary, Viking medicine was a fascinating blend of trial and error, tradition, and a bit of magic. They might not have had hospitals, but they had resourcefulness. They relied on each other, the natural world, and their spiritual beliefs to survive. Sure, some treatments were risky or bizarre by today's standards, but others, like herbal poultices and honey dressings, are still used in modern medicine. It just goes to show, people have always looked for ways to heal and protect each other. And speaking of protection, how did Viking children learn to survive in such a tough world? What skills were passed down to make sure the next generation could thrive? Let's explore that in our next section. Alright, let's take a step back and look at the Viking world through the eyes of a child. It's easy to picture fierce warriors and powerful queens, but what about the little ones? How did children in the Viking Age grow up to become skilled farmers, traders, raiders, or even poets? Well, childhood in Viking times wasn't like today. There were no schools with desks or playgrounds, no textbooks, and definitely no smartphones. Learning was hands-on, rooted in experience, observation, and the wisdom of the community. And from a pretty young age, kids were expected to pull their weight. Learning by doing. Let's start with the basics. Kids learned by doing. They followed their parents, older siblings, or neighbors to the fields, workshops, and markets. Everything was a learning opportunity. Imagine a child watching their father carve wood into a tool, or their mother preparing food with herbs. Slowly but surely, they picked it up. There were no formal lessons. Instead, learning was woven into everyday life. A child helping churn butter or gather firewood wasn't just doing chores, they were gaining survival skills. That hands-on approach was key to preparing them for adulthood. Boys and girls, different paths, same goal. Gender played a role in shaping the skills children learned. Boys were typically taught skills for farming, fishing, sailing, and fighting. From the age of 7 or so, they might start training with wooden swords or practice archery. As they got older, they'd help in hunting or even join small raids to learn the ropes. Girls, on the other hand, were taught to manage the household, cooking, weaving, taking care of livestock, and preparing herbal remedies. But let's be clear, this wasn't about keeping girls weak. Viking women were strong and respected, and these tasks were crucial to the survival of the family. And sometimes, those gender lines blurred. If a girl showed interest in sailing or a boy in cooking, families might support it. Practicality often won out over tradition. Play is preparation now. Don't think Viking children were all work and no play. Play was important, too. But their games weren't just for fun, they helped build skills. Kids played with wooden swords, dolls, and animal bones. They made up stories, mimicked adult behavior, and challenged each other in contests of strength or speed. These games helped kids develop coordination, critical thinking, and social bonds. And yes, it helped them prepare for real-life roles they'd grow into later. Stories as education. One of the most powerful teaching tools? Storytelling. Around the hearth fire, elders would share sagas, myths, and family histories. These tales weren't just entertainment, they were packed with lessons about bravery, loyalty, cunning, and fate. Kids learned what was expected of them, what to avoid, and how to make sense of their world. A story about Thor's hammer or a clever farmer's trick wasn't just fun, it was a life lesson wrapped in legend. From chores to apprenticeship. As children grew older, their responsibilities increased. Boys might be sent to another household to live as a foster child or apprentice. This wasn't seen as a rejection, it was a sign of trust. The host family would teach the child new skills, expand their network, and help shape them into capable adults. This system also strengthened alliances between families. It was kind of like sending your kid off to boarding school, only with more farming and fewer uniforms. What about education and writing? Some Viking children, especially those in wealthier families or connected to the church, had access to learning beyond survival. Monasteries and Christian influences brought writing and literacy into Viking society. A few boys, and occasionally girls, learned to read runes or Latin. They might study history, religion, or even law. But for most, literacy wasn't necessary. Knowledge lived in memory, action, and tradition. Harsh lessons from nature. Let's not sugarcoat it, life was tough. Kids learned to endure pain, face hunger, and survive cold winters. A scrape or bruise wasn't a big deal, it was part of the learning curve. By facing the harshness of the environment early, Viking children became resilient adults. And survival wasn't just about physical strength. They learned how to work together, read signs in nature, and use their instincts. It was mental toughness as much as muscle. The role of the community raising a child wasn't just the parent's job. Aunts, uncles, neighbors, and even warriors returning from raids all had lessons to offer. Skills, stories, values, these were community treasures, and everyone played a part in passing them on. Imagine a boy learning to sail from an old sea captain, or a girl learning healing herbs from a village-wise woman. It truly took a village to raise a Viking. In summary, Viking children learned survival by living it. Through chores, play, stories, and mentorship, they gained the skills they need to thrive in one of history's most challenging times. By the time they reached adulthood, they weren't just physically ready, they were mentally and emotionally prepared, too. Every scraped knee, every tale by the fire, and every lesson learned in the fields was another step toward becoming a capable Viking. But what was life really like for a grown Viking, day to day? Let's take a closer look at the challenges they faced just to keep going. So, now that we've seen how Viking children were toughened and trained by their environment, you might be wondering, what did that training prepare them for? What was daily life like for an adult Viking? Let me tell you, being a Viking wasn't easy. Not by a long shot. Sure, we picture raiders and longships, but most days weren't about glory. They were about surviving the grind. Surviving the seasons. Let's start with the seasons. The Viking world, especially in Scandinavia, was defined by long, harsh winters and short growing seasons. Imagine trying to grow crops in a place where summer barely lasts 3 months. It meant you had to make the most of every sunny day. Spring and summer were the busiest times. Farmers planted barley, rye, oats, and vegetables. They tended to livestock and repaired what winter had broken: roofs, fences, tools, you name it. Then came the harvest in early autumn. You worked sunup to sundown because if you didn't gather enough, your family might starve before spring. And winter? Winter was brutal. You'd be stuck indoors with your family and animals, relying on stored food. If the harvest had been poor, you rationed what you had. People literally hoped they could make it through the cold. Keeping fed and warm food wasn't just about cooking, it was about survival strategy. Vikings preserved meat and fish by smoking, drying, or salting. They stored root vegetables like carrots and turnips in cellars. And they made butter, cheese, and ale. Heating your home meant maintaining a fire, often in the hearth at the center of the longhouse. would had to be chopped and stored in advance. No central heating here, just layers of wool and a roaring fire. Can you imagine having to worry about freezing to death every year? Farming and livelihoods. Most Vikings were farmers first. Even warriors had to return home and tend fields between raids. Farming was back-breaking work, plowing with oxen, weeding by hand, and protecting crops from wild animals or harsh weather. But some people were craftsmen, blacksmiths, boat builders, weavers, or traders. These jobs were equally demanding. A blacksmith, for instance, had to manage heat, hammer iron, and produce tools or weapons that could mean the difference between life and death. Community responsibilities. Life wasn't all personal hustle. Vikings had community duties, too. You helped build public structures, like bridges or fences. You attended the local assembly, to vote or settle disputes. And you supported neighbors during tough times. If someone's roof collapsed in a storm, people pitched in to fix it. Health struggles. We already talked about Viking medicine, but let's be real, health was a daily concern. A cut could get infected. A toothache could become deadly. Women faced serious risks during childbirth. And there were no hospitals. People lived with aches and pains, treated what they could, and hoped for the best. The gods and spirits were often asked for help when remedies failed. Hardships at sea. Many Vikings lived near water, and seafaring was part of daily life, even if you weren't going raiding. You might fish for cod, transport goods, or ferry people. But sailing was dangerous. Storms, shipwrecks, and pirate attacks were real threats. Navigating by sun, stars, and instincts meant you had to be skilled and lucky. Social pressures and honor. Everyday Viking life wasn't just physically hard, it came with social pressures. Your reputation mattered. If you were seen as lazy, cowardly, or dishonest, it hurt your standing. People might not trade with you. Your family could be shamed. So, Vikings tried to live with honor. They followed customs, helped others, and fought for their rights. This wasn't just about pride, it was about survival in a close-knit, watchful community. Women's daily struggles. Women carried enormous responsibility. They ran the household, managed food supplies, wove clothing, and raised children. They had to be savvy economists, healers, and diplomats. If their husband died or went raiding, the wife kept everything running. That included dealing with tenants, handling money, and sometimes even defending the farm. Viking women were anything but idle. Children's contribution. We just saw how Viking children learned survival. But that wasn't just for show. They contributed to daily life, gathering firewood, watching animals, helping cook, or fetching water. Everyone worked. Religion and routine pagan rituals were part of the daily rhythm. People gave thanks to gods like Thor and Frey for good weather, crops, or protection. Small offerings, food, tools, or symbols, were made at home shrines. Even chores could become spiritual. A farmer might whisper a prayer before planting. A sailor might ask Njord for safe travel. Religion wasn't separate from life, it was woven into everything. Entertainment and joy. It wasn't all hardship. Vikings valued laughter, music, and feasting. Storytelling, songs, games, and drinking brought communities together. These moments helped balance out the hard days and made life bearable. In summary, daily Viking life? It was tough. You had to be resilient, resourceful, and community-minded. But through cooperation, tradition, and fierce determination, the Vikings endured. Now that we've explored the realities of day-to-day living, it's time to bring everything together. Let's wrap things up with a summary of what it really meant to survive in the Viking Age. So, what have we really discovered on this wild journey through the Viking Age? Well, we've seen that life back then was way more complex than just horned helmets and longships, which, by the way, they didn't actually wear. Vikings were farmers, traders, warriors, explorers, parents, and storytellers. Their world was built on community, strength, and resilience. From the construction of their cozy but crowded longhouses to their fierce loyalty to family and clan, Vikings lived lives that were deeply rooted in the land and guided by their beliefs, both in gods and in justice. They followed strict laws, made wise use of natural medicine, and taught their children survival not through books, but through living example. We peeked into their households, felt the cold of their winters, and saw how even the youngest members of Viking society were prepared for the real world. We also realized that surviving wasn't a one-person job. It was about teamwork, tradition, and knowing your place in the rhythm of nature and community. Sure, their lives were tough. But they were also rich, with meaning, with myth, and with a deep connection to the world around them. So, next time you hear the word Viking, think beyond the swords and sails. Think of the daily grind, the simple joys, and the unstoppable spirit that helped these people thrive in one of the harshest environments imaginable. Thanks for coming along on this journey. What do you think? Could you have survived the Viking Age? Scowl.